different parts in different places. So if I lose something, like that piece, I've got it attached to a carabiner on my pack. I've always got multiple ways to light that fire, like my necklace. There's nothing more important than being able to light a fire in your knife. Why is fire so important in Florida? Well, you may not need the fire to stay warm enough to stay alive like you would in Alaska, but it's very, very important for boiling water. This is how we survive, boiling our water. Not only that, but cooking food. And another big one, insect deterrents. You know, Jeffrey knows all about how I'll take some moss and wrap the moss around some pine sap and set that on fire in the little tiki torches. Remember the tiki torch we made? You know, and then we'll make our own little tiki torches it'll be like a mosquito repelling tiki torch. Well, this is just my compass. You know, I always like to have, I'm a minimalist, so I don't want to carry a compass and a magnifying glass. So I make sure I get a compass with a magnifying glass. Now this right here, this is an example of what I use for these tins for. Now, when I put a hole in a tin, it means that I'm using it to make char, like charcoal. So I take wood that's really spongy, that rotten wood, it's like cork wood, and I take that spongy wood. I like it spongy because it can carbonize more evenly. It might turn your fingers black a little bit.
Yeah. Put it like right here.
Yeah, you're a football player. So I get that spongy wood so it can carbonize more easily. But all I do to do this is I fill this tin up with spongy, corky wood. I close that tin and I make sure I put a hole in it. I just use my Scottish eye to put a hole in that. Obviously, I put the lid upside down so I didn't cave it in while I was doing it. Common sense goes a long ways out in the woods, guys. So with this hole, I put this lid on. Now imagine this is all corky, spongy wood in here. It's fresh. And I put this on my fire. Well, about 3 shakes of a gator's tail, you're gonna have white smoke that'll start bellowing out of this hole. And what that is that wood turning itself into carbon. Like it's getting rid of all that extra moisture in it and different things like that. So when the white smoke stops, that's when I take this off of the fire. I've made the mistake of opening it right when I take it off and looking, see if it worked or not, because I want all that to be all black. I don't want it to be half black. Yeah. And I'll look at it, oh man, it worked great. And then I put the lid back on and I check it the next day and it's a thin layer of ash at the bottom. Well, because when I take it right off of the fire, it's still very hot. And if I take the lid off, so much oxygen gets inside. And when I put the lid back on, those coals turn into live coals that are red hot. And they burn away in that little tin. So the trick is, you put it in the fire, wait the white smoke to stop coming out of that hole, then you take it off the fire, and then you wait until it's cool to the touch. You want to be able to open that lid with your hand and it not be that hot. If it is, it means it's not ready. So when I open it after it's not hot, then if it worked, it's not going to turn into live coal and I'll go away when I put that lid back on. If I open it and see that, you know, this wood is only half black and the other half still nice and corky, that wood that I put in there, then I know to put it back on the fire, it wasn't done. You know, but if you get that soft wood like that corky wood, it works every time. Yeah. Now, why I brought up the magnifying glass doesn't necessarily work on a day quite like right now or blue sky over there, but by getting the sunshine and I put this down and I get that little bead of light going on there, I can start one of those coals, nothing but my magnifying glass. And then I take my little coal right there that I've got going, and I place that in my little monkey hair nest, start blowing on it, boom, I got fire. And so I've always got multiple ways of me being able to light a fire, just because you never know what kind of situation you're gonna be in. Survival situations are nothing more than an unplanned camping trip. And as soon as you have that mindset to just realize this is just an unplanned camping trip, then you're gonna be fine. Because in a survival situation, mindset is everything. If you're scared, that's when you start making mistakes. You start second guessing yourself. Nothing's going right. If you just remember, man, Captain Planet taught me all this. I know how to do this. This is nothing but an unplanned camping trip. I don't have my tent, but Captain told me how to build a primitive shelter and such like that, like we're gonna do on Wednesday. You know, so I could find me a long branch, right? We'll just use this as an example. And I lean this over into a fork of a tree, like that. And I'd sleep under here, but I'd sit there and line all this up like a tent with my other tree branches, with saw palmettos. If it was getting cold, I'd put a bunch of leaves there under me and a bunch of leaves over it, and moss, anything I could. Not usually a thing in Florida. We're just trying to keep the mosquitoes away, right? Yeah. So usually our saw palmettos make for a really great roof. That's why the Miccosukee and the Seminole Nation's been using cabbage palms and soft palmettos for their roofs since the beginning. You know, that Crowley Museum that I went to, people were seeing that cracker cabin that I took a video of. Like, man, I'd live in that in a heartbeat. Man, not me. Like, if I lived back in Florida without air conditioning, I would live in a chickie way before I would live in a cabin with walls on it. You know, so the chickies, like what Mark's ancestors grew up in, you know, they're thatched roofs with open walls, and it's meant for that breathability. Well, it's like, well, what about the mosquitoes? As far as, well, you don't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes. Well, that's why every chickie, you know, would have a fire ring in there. You know, and you would be burning the fire to get that smoke. You know, it doesn't really bother you at all. As far as, well, how do you not get eaten by alligators in the middle of the night? Well, they'd sleep on raised platforms. So imagine this picnic table with no benches, you know, and that's where they'd sleep across. You know, so in my opinion, if I had to be down here pre-air conditioning, I would have lived in a chickie before I would have lived in a cabin with 4 walls. Yeah. Even though they made those breathable with the crosswinds, as far as the cabins, the chickies are much more breathable.
How did the Indians, how'd they get their water?
Water, they would do anything from their fresh water sources, obviously, and even use plants to help purify, like the bladderwort. I call it the Miccosukee life straw. My auntie, she's a Panther clan of the Miccosukee Nation. She would talk about how they would take the bladderwort plant, which is a great water filter, and they would take it and they'd squeeze all the water out of it. Well, then they'd put it back into the water, like the Everglades, for example, and then put it on the bow of their canoe. Well, when they put it on the bow of the canoe, they let that water on the outside of the plant dry up. Well, it has all these little bladders in it, bladderwort. They'd lift that up to their face and start drinking. You know, so it was a way to filter the water full of pathogens. That was something that they would use on the fly. But as far as like how would natives drink the water, you have to remember that this land wasn't always poisoned. You know, like. Do you think my Lakota ancestors had to boil water every time they drank? No, they went to the rivers and they drank out of it. But this was before all of our chemicals, all of our pollution, all of our nastiness. To where now, if I go and take a drink out of that river, I'm gonna get sick and could die. You know, like now we have to boil that water. Well, see, back in the day, you know, it was certain situations that you might have to boil some water, or certain situations where you might be using that bladderwort, but for the most part, the water was okay. It hadn't been tainted. You know, you could drink out of the river and be fine. You know,
when I was a kid,
the more the water is moving, the better off you are. The more stagnant water is, the more the ability of the microbiology and pathogens to be taking over. Yeah. You know, so like Giardia that comes from beavers, that would have always been a thing. But that's why an Indian, for example, wouldn't drink out of a small pond covered with beavers, and he would be going over to the river to get his drinking water where water moves, because he knows that beaver can't poop enough to make Giardia an issue for dysentery. You know, so it's kind of a different lifestyle. You got to think too, tribes didn't stay put as much. They were more hunters and gatherers and more constantly on the move. So it's not like we need to figure out a cistern. You know, even with the chickies, you think of them more like seasonal houses. You know, the Seminoles and the Miccosukees down here would spend a lot of times like in Georgia, you know, and they would come down to the Everglades in the wintertime because they knew that there was always food there. And obviously it wouldn't be as cold, right? You know, so you think of that more like seasonal houses, and all the the grocery stores and Walgreens as far as plants in between. You know, so when the cavalry started chasing the Indians back in the day, the Miccosukee and the Seminole Nations, they knew, and this is according to my Aunt Betty Osceola and the way she tells it, you know, they knew that the Everglades existed, even though they lived more in Georgia. But they knew the Everglades existed because that was a refuge for very harsh winters. So when the cavalry was chasing them, they chose to flee down to the Everglades because they knew that the horses couldn't get through those swamps. You know, that they knew that the cavalry wouldn't dare chase them through all these alligators and mosquitoes and just this great unknown.
They didn't lose like